What kind of force ratio produces an 8-to-1 kill ratio when you're the smaller force? On November 14, 1965, 450 American soldiers from the 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry landed in a clearing roughly the size of a football field and spent the next 3 days killing roughly 1,800 North Vietnamese regulars from 3 different regiments. The NVA had every advantage that matters in infantry combat: numbers, position, prepared terrain, initiative. They had more than 2,000 soldiers already dug into the Ia Drang Valley when the first Huey touched down at landing zone X-ray. The Americans had 16 helicopters and whatever they could carry. That ratio, 8-to-1 in favor of the outnumbered force, violates just about everything military planners assume about combat. The U.S. Army's own doctrinal manuals at the time recommended a 3-to-1 advantage for an attacking force against a prepared defense. The men at X-ray weren't attacking. They weren't prepared. They were landing blind into a clearing surrounded by 1,600 meters of elephant grass and dry creek beds filled with NVA soldiers who had been operating in the area for weeks. The after-action report from 3rd Brigade describes the initial contact as meeting engagement, which is Army language for walking into somebody you didn't expect. Both sides were surprised. Only one side adapted fast enough. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore had 16 minutes of useful time between the first helicopter insertion and the first NVA assault. 16 minutes to establish a perimeter in terrain he'd never seen, with a force that was still arriving in lifts because there weren't enough helicopters to bring everyone at once. His battalion was arriving in pieces, a company at a time, sometimes a platoon at a time, into a landing zone that was already taking fire by the second lift. The NVA 66th Regiment had been resting in the Chupong Massif directly to the west. Their base camps sat less than a mile from where Moore's helicopters were settling into the tall grass. The standard explanation for what happened next involves B-52 strikes, artillery, and close air support, and those mattered enormously. But they don't explain the first hours. For the first critical phase of the battle, the men on the ground at X-ray fought with M16s, M60 machine guns, hand grenades, and in at least 2 documented cases, their bare hands. Specialist Bill Beck of Bravo Company fired his weapon until the barrel warped. Lieutenant Joe Marm charged a machine gun position alone and took a round through the jaw. Second Lieutenant Walter Marm, no relation, called in artillery so close to his own position that fragments hit his men, because the NVA were closer than the fragments. The 66th Regiment was not a militia. These were North Vietnamese Army regulars who had marched down the Ho Chi Minh Trail for months to reach the Central Highlands. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Hu An, was a veteran of Dien Bien Phu. He had watched the French 1st Colonial Parachute Battalion land in a valley not entirely unlike this one 11 years earlier, and he had helped destroy it, and had studied helicopter tactics specifically because he anticipated this kind of engagement. His plan was straightforward and sound. Close the distance to negate American firepower, isolate small units, overwhelm them before reinforcement. It almost worked. Bravo Company's 2nd Platoon, led by Lieutenant Henry Herrick, got separated from the main perimeter within the first hour. All but 6 of them were killed or wounded. The NVA used their bodies as cover to push closer to the battalion position. By late afternoon on the 14th, Moore's perimeter was compressed to roughly 100 meters in diameter. Ammunition was running low. 2 of his companies were in heavy contact on 3 sides simultaneously. His reserve consisted of a recon platoon, and whatever walking wounded could hold a rifle. He called Broken Arrow. That code phrase meant an American unit was about to be overrun. It diverted every available aircraft in South Vietnam to his position. Fighters, bombers, armed helicopters, anything within range turned toward the Ia Drang Valley. The Air Force scrambled aircraft from as far away as Bien Hoa and Tan Son Nhut. Within the hour, F-100 Super Sabres were dropping napalm so close to the perimeter that Moore's men could feel the heat singe their eyebrows. The question isn't whether firepower saved LZ X-ray. It did. The question is how 450 men survived long enough for that firepower to arrive. By June 1965, 5 months before Moore's helicopters settled into that clearing, the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, didn't officially exist. The unit that would fight at X-Ray was still called the 11th Air Assault Division, a test formation at Fort Benning that half the Pentagon wanted to kill. The Army's old guard thought the entire concept was an expensive stunt. Helicopters were for medevac and moving generals around. You didn't build a division around them. The man who disagreed loudest was General James Gavin, the legendary paratrooper commander who had jumped into Sicily and Normandy and who published an article in Harper's Magazine in 1954, arguing that the Army needed to abandon its obsession with heavy armor and embrace what he called sky cavalry. Gavin's argument was simple. The helicopter did what the horse had done for cavalry. It provided speed, reach, shock, and the ability to bypass obstacles entirely. But it did those things in 3 dimensions across terrain that would stop a tank column dead. The Ia Drang Valley was exactly the kind of place Gavin had in mind. No roads. Canopy so thick that ground movement meant hacking through jungle at 500 meters per hour. The only way to get a meaningful force into that terrain quickly was to fly above it and drop straight down. The Army tested the idea for 2 years under the designation Project Long Thrust, and then the larger AIR Assault 2 exercises, running simulated combat operations across the Carolinas with every helicopter they could borrow. The results were decisive enough to convince Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who loved data the way some men love whiskey. McNamara's Housey Board, named for Lieutenant General Hamilton Howze, another old cavalryman, recommended creating a full airmobile division with 459 aircraft. The number staggered people. A standard infantry division had maybe a dozen helicopters for liaison work. The airmobile concept called for enough Hueys, Chinooks, and armed gunships to lift an entire battalion in a single wave, set it down in hostile territory, keep it supplied by air, and extract it when the mission was done. The 11th Air Assault became the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, on July 1, 1965, inheriting the lineage of the old Horse Cavalry Division that had chased Pancho Villa across Mexico and charged through the Philippines. The yellow shoulder patch stayed. The horses did not. What arrived at Ankei Base Camp in September 1965 was unlike anything the U.S. military had fielded before. The division had roughly 15,800 soldiers and more aircraft than some air forces. The smell of JP-4 jet fuel hung over the base camp like a permanent weather system, mixed with red laterite dust that coated everything: skin, weapons, food. Crew chiefs slept under their helicopters because there weren't enough tents. Pilots flew 4, 5, 6 sorties a day during the initial setup operations, ferrying troops into clearings they'd never scouted in terrain that didn't match their maps because the maps were French and 10 years out of date. The tactical concept Moore would use at X-Ray came directly from the Airmobile playbook. Find the enemy with small reconnaissance elements, then pile on with helicopter-borne infantry faster than the enemy can react. The doctrine assumed you could always reinforce faster than the enemy could mass, that helicopters would be available, that landing zones would function. It assumed a lot of things that the Ia Drang Valley would test to destruction. But the deeper assumption was the one that mattered most, and it was cultural rather than tactical. The airmobile concept bet everything on junior leaders making fast decisions under pressure without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. A battalion commander in a helicopter overhead couldn't control a platoon fight in elephant grass. The platoon leader on the ground had to fight his own battle, call his own fire support, manage his own casualties, and decide when to pull back. The 1st Cavalry Division trained for this relentlessly at Benning, small unit leaders making independent decisions at speed. Whether that training was good enough would depend entirely on what happened when those leaders met the 66th Regiment face-to-face in the scrub brush west of the Chupong Massif. Moore read Bernard Fall's books the way a mechanic reads wiring diagrams, not for pleasure, but because getting it wrong meant somebody died. Falls Street Without Joy in Hell in a very small place, documented in forensic detail how the French groupement Mobile 100 had been annihilated in the Central Highlands in 1954, ambushed on Route 19, less than 40 miles from where the 1st Cavalry Division was now based. The French had been road-bound, column-bound, predictable. They moved in straight lines through terrain that swallowed straight lines whole. Moore marked up his copies with pencil notes, dog-eared the pages about French failures at fire coordination, underlined every passage where a unit lost contact with its neighbors. He made his officers read them too. The obsession went beyond books. At Fort Benning, Moore had run his battalion through airmobile exercises until the men could practically sleepwalk through a helicopter assault sequence. Load times, exit times, rally points, actions on contact, every phase rehearsed until it was automatic. He timed his riflemen getting off the Hueys. 8 seconds was the standard. He wanted 5. A helicopter sitting on a landing zone was a target, and every extra second multiplied the odds of losing the aircraft and the men still inside it. But the preparation that mattered most was the decision he made about where he personally would be during an air assault. Moore insisted on riding the first helicopter into any landing zone, the battalion commander first on the ground. This was not standard practice. It was arguably reckless. Losing your commander in the first minutes of a battle is the kind of catastrophe that unravels entire operations. Moore's reasoning was blunt. He needed to see the terrain with his own eyes before committing the rest of his force. Maps lied. Aerial photographs missed things. The only way to know whether a landing zone could actually function was to stand on it, look at the tree lines, feel the ground under your boots, and make the call in person. If the LZ was wrong, he wanted to be the one to wave off the following lifts before 400 men were committed to a position that couldn't be held. His sergeant major, Basil Plumley, came with him. Plumley was the kind of senior NCO that the Army doesn't really produce anymore. A combat veteran of World War II and Korea who had made 4 parachute jumps into combat, including Normandy on D-Day. He carried a .45 pistol instead of an M16 at X-ray. When asked why, his explanation was economical. He said, if the situation got bad enough that he needed a rifle, there would be plenty lying on the ground. Plumley's job was to be everywhere Moore couldn't be, enforcing discipline by presence alone. The two of them had worked together long enough that communication was mostly unnecessary. Moore pointed, Plumley moved. The battalion that flew into the Ia Drang on November 14th had been shaped by a commander who assumed the worst and prepared accordingly. Moore expected to be outnumbered, expected the landing zone to be hot, expected to lose helicopters and men and radio contact with higher headquarters. What he did not expect, what nobody in the American chain of command expected, was that his 450-man battalion would land almost directly on top of 3 NVA regiments, totaling roughly 2,000 soldiers, who were at that very moment planning their own offensive operation against the Special Forces camp at Play Me. The first sound was the rotor wash flattening the elephant grass into a perfect circle, blasting red dust and dry vegetation outward in a ring that made the clearing look like something had punched the earth from above. Moore's Huey settled at 10:48 a.m., and he was on the ground before the skids stopped rocking. The termite mound he'd spotted from the air, chest high, hard as concrete, sat near the center of the clearing. He marked it immediately as his command post. Plumley was already moving, 45 on his hip, scanning the western tree line where the Chupong Massif rose dark and steep against the morning sky. The clearing was tighter than the maps suggested, maybe 100 meters across at its widest, ringed by scrub brush and stunted trees that gave way to elephant grass taller than a man within 30 meters of the open ground. Dry creek beds, what the maps called draws, radiated outward from the LZ like fingers, cutting through the brush toward the mountain. Moore noted them instantly. Those creek beds were natural avenues of approach, and they pointed straight from the massif to his landing zone. Anything coming off that mountain would use them. Alpha Company under Captain Tony Nadal came in on the first lift alongside Moore's command group. Roughly 80 men total, which was all 16 Hueys, could carry in a single wave. The rest of the battalion was back at Play Me, waiting for the helicopters to return. Round-trip time was approximately 30 minutes, so Moore had 80 soldiers on the ground, the next lift half an hour away, and a mountain full of NVA less than a mile to his west. He pushed Nadal's platoons out immediately, fanning them into the tree lines to establish a perimeter and probe toward the Massif. Bravo Company under Captain John Herron would come on the second lift, Charlie Company after that. The battalion would assemble itself in pieces over the next 2 hours, assuming nothing went wrong. Something went wrong almost immediately. Nadal's men pushed northwest into the creek beds and within minutes captured an NVA soldier. The prisoner was unarmed, disheveled, apparently a deserter or straggler. Through an interpreter, he started talking, and what he said rearranged everything Moore thought he knew about the tactical situation. The prisoner told them there were 3 battalions of NVA on the mountain. 3 battalions. That meant somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 enemy soldiers sitting in prepared positions on the high ground directly above the landing zone, and Moore had 80 men on the ground with the next company still airborne. The intelligence estimates had been wrong. MACV's assessment suggested NVA elements in the valley, maybe a battalion, probably dispersed. The prisoner was describing a force 4 times that size, concentrated, rested, ready to fight. Moore's after-action report notes the prisoner's information in flat, measured language. The tone of a commander who already knows that panic is useless. He adjusted. He radioed Colonel Tim Brown, the brigade commander orbiting above in his helicopter, and requested that Bravo Company's lift be expedited. He pulled Nadal's platoons in tighter, shortening the perimeter, trading ground for density. If he was about to be hit by a regiment, he wanted his men close enough to support each other. The second lift came in at approximately 11:20 a.m. Herron's Bravo Company piled off the Hueys and moved directly into the tree line to extend the perimeter south and southwest. The helicopters clattered back toward Play Me for Charlie Company. Moore now had roughly 160 men on the ground, spread across a perimeter maybe 200 meters in diameter, with a mountain full of enemy soldiers who, as the prisoner had made clear, knew the Americans were there. At 12:15 p.m., Herron's 2nd Platoon under Lieutenant Henry Herrick was moving through heavy brush along one of the creek beds when they spotted a small group of NVA soldiers. The enemy troops appeared to be withdrawing up the slope. Herrick's platoon pursued. This was exactly the kind of aggressive small unit initiative the airmobile doctrine demanded. Find the enemy, fix him, pile on. But Herrick's platoon was chasing a thread attached to something enormous, and the thread was pulling them out of the perimeter, out of mutual support range, deeper into the creek bed toward the mountain. By the time Herrick realized what was happening, the NVA weren't withdrawing anymore. 12:45 p.m. The entire western tree line erupted. The NVA came out of the creek beds in waves, not the disorganized rush of guerrillas, but the disciplined assault formations of regular infantry, soldiers running in lines with fixed bayonets, AK-47s firing from the hip, bugles sounding above the gunfire to coordinate the advance. Herrick's platoon was already cut off 200 meters beyond the perimeter, taking fire from 3 sides, and now the main assault hit Nadal's Alpha Company positions along the southern and western edges of the clearing with a force that bent the line backward like a bow. Moore was at the termite mound working 4 radio nets simultaneously: artillery net, air support net, battalion command net, brigade net. The man had 2 handsets pressed to his ears and a third waiting in Plumley's fist. He called in the first artillery mission within minutes of the assault, 105mm howitzers from LZ Falcon, 8 miles east, dropping rounds dangerously close to his own lines because the NVA were that close. The shells came screaming overhead and detonated in the tree line with concussions that shook dirt loose from the termite mound. Fragments hissed through the canopy. At that range, the margin between friendly and enemy positions was maybe 50 meters, which is nothing when you're adjusting fire by sound and radio relay. Along the perimeter, the fight broke into a dozen separate battles that no single commander could control. This was the moment the airmobile doctrine either worked or didn't. Platoon leaders, lieutenants in their mid-20s, most of them in their first real combat, were making life-or-death calls about fire distribution, withdrawal routes, casualty evacuation. ammunition resupply, all while NVA soldiers pushed close enough to throw grenades into their positions. Nadal's platoon sergeants anchored the line through sheer physical presence, grabbing riflemen by their web gear and shoving them into firing positions, redistributing ammunition from the dead to the living. Charlie Company under Captain Bob Edwards was still airborne. Moore needed them desperately, but the LZ was now under direct fire. Huey's landing in that clearing would be landing in a shooting gallery. Moore made the call to bring them in anyway. The helicopter pilots dropped into X-ray through smoke and small arms fire, flaring hard over the elephant grass while door gunners raked the tree lines on both sides. Edwards' men jumped off the skids into chaos and ran straight into the perimeter without briefing, without orientation, plugging gaps in the line by following the sound of the heaviest firing. The NVA assault stalled somewhere around 2 p.m., not because the attackers quit, but because American artillery and aerial rocket runs had torn apart their assault formations in the creek beds before they could mass for a second wave. Moore had called in everything available: tube artillery, aerial rocket artillery from Huey gunships, and tactical airstrikes from A-1 Sky Raiders that dropped napalm so close to the perimeter that the heat washed over American foxholes in visible waves, the orange light flickering across faces pressed flat against the dirt. But Herrick's platoon was still out there, cut off and surrounded, bleeding out. Lieutenant Herrick was already dead, killed early in the fighting, his platoon now led by Sergeant Ernie Savage, a man who had never expected to command anything larger than a squad. Broken Arrow was the most desperate radio call in the American military vocabulary, and Moore transmitted it at approximately 2:30 p.m. on November 14th, when the NVA launched their second massed assault and the southern perimeter began to collapse inward. The call meant one thing: a ground unit was being overrun. Every available combat aircraft in the theater, every fighter, every bomber, every armed helicopter, regardless of current mission or assignment, was to divert immediately to the coordinates specified. Other operations, other priorities, all of it ceased to exist. Broken Arrow meant Americans were about to die in large numbers unless the sky itself intervened. The response was enormous. F-100 Super Sabres from Bien Hoa and Pleiku broke off from other missions mid-flight, dumped their ordnance planning, and turned toward the Ia Drang Valley. B-57 Canberra bombers carrying 500-pound bombs redirected from targets further north. A-1E Sky Raiders, the slow, ugly, propeller-driven workhorses that could loiter over a battlefield for hours carrying more ordnance than a World War II bomber, stacked up in holding patterns above X-ray, waiting for their turn to roll in. Huey gunships from multiple aviation companies converged on the valley from every direction. Within 30 minutes of the call, Moore had more aircraft overhead than he had radio frequencies to talk to them on. The forward air controllers, orbiting above the battle in their tiny O-1 Bird Dog spotter planes, became the most important men in the sky, sequencing strikes with a precision that bordered on reckless given how close the NVA were to American positions. And the NVA were close. On the southern perimeter, enemy soldiers had pushed to within 20 meters of Charlie Company's foxholes. Some of the fighting was hand-to-hand. Bob Edwards had been hit, wounded by mortar fragments, and was commanding from the ground propped against a tree, refusing evacuation because there was nobody to replace him and the medevac helicopters couldn't land anyway. The NVA were feeding fresh companies into the assault from multiple creek beds simultaneously, and the sheer density of bodies in the tree line meant that American rifle fire alone couldn't stop the advance. Moore needed high explosives delivered with surgical accuracy onto positions close enough that his own men could hear the enemy officers shouting commands. The Sky Raider pilots delivered. They came in low, 200 feet above the canopy in some cases, dropping napalm canisters that tumbled end over end into the tree line and erupted in rolling walls of orange flame that sucked the oxygen out of the creek beds. The heat signature was visible from miles away, a column of black smoke rising above the Chupong Massif like a signal fire. Between napalm runs, the F-100s made high-speed passes with 20mm cannon fire that chewed through the undergrowth in long diagonal lines of dust and shredded vegetation. One Sky Raider pilot, Major Bruce Crandall's after-action account notes, made 14 separate passes over the perimeter in a single sortie. The pilot's name doesn't appear in the records I've found. What made Broken Arrow work wasn't just the volume of firepower, it was the fact that Moore's artillery forward observers and the airborne FACs had spent the previous 2 hours building a shared mental picture of the battlefield. They already knew which creek beds the NVA were using, knew the exact tree line coordinates where the enemy staging areas sat. When the floodgates opened and every aircraft in Vietnam showed up wanting to help, the controllers didn't waste sorties on empty jungle. They stacked the ordnance precisely where it would shatter the next assault wave before it could form. The second NVA attack broke apart by 3:30 p.m. The 66th Regiment had been fighting since the French War, and their soldiers didn't lack courage. Their willingness to advance through napalm and fragmentation was something American survivors described with a respect that sounds almost bewildered in the after-action interviews. The attack broke because the assault formations were being destroyed in the assembly areas, killed before they could organize into coherent units. Squads that started a charge with 12 men reached the perimeter with 4. Companies that should have hit the line as a coordinated wave arrived as scattered groups of survivors stumbling through shattered trees. Savage's cut-off platoon was still surrounded. They could hear the airstrikes landing around them, feel the ground shaking, smell the napalm. Nobody was coming to get them yet. Moore told his company commanders to prepare for a long night. His exact phrasing, according to multiple accounts, was that the NVA would be back and that nobody was sleeping. Darkness came fast. In the Central Highlands, the sun drops behind the mountains, and within 20 minutes, the jungle goes black. Not dim, not shadowy, but the kind of absolute dark where you can't see your own hand unless a flare is burning overhead. Moore had arranged for continuous artillery illumination from LZ Falcon, 105mm rounds fired high that popped open at altitude and drifted down under small parachutes, casting the clearing and surrounding tree lines in a swinging yellow-white light that made the shadows move. Shadows looked like men. A shifting branch became a rifle barrel, then became a branch again. The trip flares went out first, thin wire strung ankle-height across the creek beds and likely avenues of approach, each one attached to a magnesium flare that would ignite on contact and burn white-hot for 30 seconds. When the first NVA probe came at around 10 p.m., 3 flares popped simultaneously in the southwestern tree line, and the perimeter opened up with everything it had: M16s, M60 machine guns, grenade launchers, firing at shapes silhouetted against that sudden chemical brightness. The probe pulled back. 15 minutes later, another flare tripped on the opposite side, then another. The NVA were testing the perimeter, probing for the weak point, and they were doing it with a patience that suggested professional leadership. Each probe drew American fire, which revealed positions. Moore understood this and passed the word to limit response. Fire only at confirmed targets, conserve ammunition, let the flares do the work. Easier said than done when you're 22 years old and something is moving in the dark 30 feet from your foxhole. The major assault hit at approximately 4 a.m. on November 15th. The 33rd Regiment, fresh troops who hadn't fought the previous afternoon, came out of the Chupong in battalion strength and struck the southeastern perimeter where Charlie Company's depleted line was thinnest. Edwards' men were short on ammunition, carrying wounded in every foxhole, running on the kind of exhausted discipline that either holds or shatters with nothing in between. The NVA broke through the outer line in 2 places. American soldiers fought from their holes with bayonets fixed, rifle butts swinging, hand grenades dropped at their own feet because the enemy was that close. Moore called in artillery at minimum safe distance, then closer. Rounds landed 50 meters from friendly positions, then 30. Plumlee moved through the line in the dark, physically checking positions, redistributing magazines taken from the dead. The man was 45 years old, a veteran of World War II and Korea, and his presence at each foxhole did something that no radio call could accomplish. By dawn, the line held, barely. but it held. An M16 magazine, empty, lying in the red dirt next to a foxhole where the soldier who'd fired it was sleeping with his eyes open. That blank 1,000-yard stare that isn't sleep at all, but the body's refusal to process anything further. The sun came up over the Ia Drang Valley at approximately 6:20 a.m. on November 15th, and the light revealed something that the men on the perimeter had only sensed in the dark. The ground in front of Charlie Company's positions was covered with bodies. NVA dead lay in rows, actual rows, the formation lines still visible in death, marking the exact geometry of the assault waves that had broken against the perimeter during the night. Some had fallen within arm's reach of American foxholes. A few had fallen inside them. The after-action report from 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry uses the phrase "carpet of enemy dead" to describe the approaches from the south and southwest. That language sounds like exaggeration until you look at the body count methodology. Recovery teams working the tree lines on November 15th and 16th counted 634 NVA killed by body in the immediate vicinity of X-ray. The actual number was certainly higher. Artillery and napalm don't leave bodies you can count, and the NVA were dragging their dead and wounded back toward the Chupong throughout the battle. Intelligence estimates from MACV put total NVA losses across the 3-day engagement between 1,200 and 1,800 killed. American losses at X-ray were 79 dead and 121 wounded, 79 against somewhere north of 1,000. Moore walked the perimeter that morning with Plumley and Dillon, his operations officer. The scene in front of the southern foxholes was the worst. Bodies stacked 2 and 3 deep where the 4 a.m. assault had piled up against interlocking fields of M60 fire. The machine gunners had done exactly what they'd trained to do at Benning, laying down fixed, final protective fires along predetermined lines that turned the creek bed approaches into kill zones. Training, doctrine, all those months of rehearsal at Fort Benning, it had worked. The M60s had chewed through barrel after barrel during the night, the assistant gunners swapping them out bare-handed and burning their palms because there wasn't time to use the asbestos mitt. Several guns were on their 3rd barrel by dawn. The NVA weapons scattered across the clearing told their own story. Soviet-made AK-47s, RPD light machine guns, B-40 rocket launchers, Chinese stick grenades with wooden handles. Quality equipment, well maintained. This wasn't a militia force armed with captured French leftovers. The 66th and 33rd regiments carried weapons that were factory new in some cases, supplied through a logistics pipeline that ran from Hanoi down the Ho Chi Minh Trail with a reliability that American intelligence had badly underestimated. The enemy had come equipped to win and in sufficient numbers to do it. They attacked with the kind of coordinated aggression that should have overrun a battalion-sized perimeter, defended by troops who'd been on the ground less than 24 hours. So why didn't they? The answer was already obvious to Moore that morning, even if the Pentagon would spend years arguing about it. American firepower, specifically the ability to deliver massive quantities of high explosives with precision onto targets within meters of friendly positions, had broken every assault before it could achieve the mass needed to overwhelm the perimeter. The NVA had the infantry skill. They had the willingness to absorb casualties that would have stopped most armies cold. What they lacked was any counter to a battalion commander who could put a curtain of steel and fire around his position within minutes of picking up a radio handset, who could call in jet aircraft from bases 100 miles away and have them dropping ordnance within 15 minutes, who could keep artillery falling continuously for hours because the American logistics system could manufacture and deliver 105mm shells faster than the guns could fire them. The reinforcements arrived mid-morning. Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry marched into the perimeter on foot, and the relief on the faces of Moore's men was visible. Fresh ammunition, fresh water, fresh bodies to fill the gaps in the line where casualties had opened them. Moore's battalion had been fighting for roughly 20 hours, with no sleep, limited resupply, and casualties approaching 40% in some platoons. Savage's platoon was still out there. The relief column that reached them later that morning found survivors huddled in a tiny perimeter, roughly 25 meters across, the wounded in the center, the dead forming part of the cover. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade marched his 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry out of X-ray on the morning of November 17th in a column formation stretching nearly 550 meters through dense jungle, and walked straight into the worst American defeat of the entire Vietnam War that nobody back home would hear about for decades. The contrast with Moore's battle is so stark, it reads like a controlled experiment. Same division, same regiment in fact, 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit, which by this point in the week had earned that association twice over. Same enemy force, or what remained of it. The NVA 66th Regiment, bloodied at X-ray but still combat effective, had repositioned along the route to LZ Albany and was waiting in the tree lines on both sides of the trail. McDade's column was strung out, units intermixed, no clear march discipline. When the ambush detonated at approximately 1:15 p.m., the NVA didn't hit the front or the rear. They hit the middle, splitting the battalion in half and then swarming into the gap. The killing was close range and chaotic, almost medieval in its intimacy. NVA soldiers rose from spider holes and anthills within feet of the column and fired into packed clusters of Americans who couldn't maneuver because the elephant grass was too thick to see through and too dense to move through quickly. No perimeter had been established, so there was nothing to defend. Nobody had plotted artillery coordinates during the march, so there was no fire support to call. The forward air controllers overhead couldn't drop ordnance because they couldn't distinguish friendly from enemy. The two forces were intermingled so completely that from the air the battle looked like a single, writhing mass in the tall grass. The British had learned this lesson at Isandlwana in 1879. A strong force, poorly deployed, destroyed by an enemy it had just beaten in a previous engagement. The Zulu impi that overran the British camp did so not because British firepower had failed, but because British leadership had failed to concentrate it. Albany was the same equation with automatic weapons. In roughly 16 minutes, 155 Americans were dead and another 124 wounded. Those numbers represent casualties approaching 70% in the companies caught in the kill zone. Survivors described NVA soldiers walking among the wounded, executing them with single shots. The after-action reports from Albany are difficult reading, the clinical language straining against events that resist clinical description. Moore's battalion, 2 days earlier, had faced the same enemy in comparable numbers and won decisively. McDade's battalion, with every advantage of knowing the NVA were in the area, was nearly annihilated. The variable wasn't firepower or equipment, wasn't American courage or lack of it. Moore had built his perimeter before the enemy arrived. McDade never got the chance to build one at all. A captured NVA officer's notebook, recovered near X-ray, contained detailed sketches of American helicopter landing formations and notes on rotor sound signatures at various distances. The enemy had been studying the 1st Cavalry Division for weeks before the 1st Huey touched down. Both sides looked at the Ia Drang Valley and saw confirmation of what they already believed. Westmoreland flew to the battlefield on November 19th, toured the positions, received the briefings, and came away convinced that American firepower and mobility could destroy North Vietnamese main force units faster than Hanoi could replace them. The math was seductive. 79 Americans killed at X-ray against over 1,000 NVA dead. Project those ratios across 100 engagements, 1,000, and the war becomes an industrial equation where American productive capacity grinds down the enemy's willingness to absorb losses. The strategy had a name within months: attrition. MACV's planning documents from early 1966 are saturated with the vocabulary of body counts, kill ratios, crossover points, the moment when enemy casualties would exceed their ability to recruit and infiltrate replacements. Albany should have been the counterargument. It wasn't. The 155 dead at Albany got folded into the same statistical framework, treated as an anomaly rather than a warning. The Ia Drang after-action review that reached the Pentagon emphasized X-ray's success and buried Albany's catastrophe in appendices. One staff officer at MACV described the overall operation as an unprecedented validation of airmobile doctrine, which was true if you only read the first half of the week. Hanoi drew its own conclusions, and they were smarter. General Nguyen Hu An, who had commanded the NVA forces at both X-Ray and Albany, reported to his superiors that the Americans could be beaten if engaged at close range where their firepower advantage collapsed. The phrase he used, according to Vietnamese military histories published after the war, translates roughly to grab them by the belt buckle, get so close that American artillery and air support become as dangerous to the Americans as to the NVA. Albany had proved the concept and spent the next decade refining it. So the airmobile concept worked. Combined arms worked. Small unit leadership at the platoon and company level worked brilliantly under conditions that would have broken less trained formations. And all of that was real, validated in blood at X-ray. What nobody in Washington wanted to confront was the other half of the data, that the NVA had also learned, also adapted, and had walked away from the Ia Drang with their own version of confidence. Moore left Vietnam in 1966. He'd been promoted to full colonel, given a staff assignment. Years later, when asked about the battle, he kept coming back to the same point, not the tactics or the firepower or the kill ratio. He said he thought about the men he left behind on that field, and the men who would follow them into that same valley, and the ones after that. He packed his footlocker at Pleiku, climbed aboard a transport aircraft, and flew east toward the ocean.